All right, hello. Looks like the audio setup is functioning, so that's good. I'm not screaming at anyone, so that's always very helpful. Hello, my name is Joe Slowik. Thank you for welcoming me here. It's always a pleasure to be in Switzerland. As you can tell, my English is quite good. My French is quite bad, so thank you for allowing me to speak in a language that I won't embarrass myself in. But currently I lead threat detection development, or threat intelligence development, but also detection engineering and threat hunting for a company called Huntress in the United States. I also do consulting and training through a company of my own called Paralis. But today we're here to talk about something threat intelligence related concerning adversary tracking. And as you can tell from the subtitle, all the lies we tell ourselves. So perhaps we will touch upon something that might be a little interesting. So for an agenda for today, what we'll discuss is first, what's an adversary mean? Because we throw the word around quite easily, but we don't take much time in order to sit down and actually think what that means. And once we have that settled, we'll look at the current threat environment and how adversaries relate to the tools and the capabilities they leverage as part of intrusion operations. With that settled, we'll then move into some examples of what it really looks like when we talk about certain adversaries and how we track them or what we think that they might be, and conclude with some parting thoughts, not just on the role of threat intelligence, but also its applicability to various other disciplines ranging from detection development, red teaming, and other exercises. So first, defining adversaries. What does that mean? Well, we could look at the black hooded hacker or whatever in the hooded sweatshirt and so forth. That is probably a headache-inducing picture now that I look at it. I should have picked something different. But, okay, so we've got the stereotypical hacker image. But we also have, our state-sponsored adversaries that my government decides to put up a wanted poster as if this really means anything. But we identify these persons by name, that they're part of some threat entity, and so that's an adversary of a type. Or we could have some gentleman who is a very well-accomplished business person posing with his, I believe that's a Lamborghini in front of St. Basil's Cathedral. And, that's an adversary as well if you're involved in e-crime. But looking at all of these together, really we're talking about just sort of picking and choosing among various personas that define what it is when we think about who's on the other side of the keyboard or the other side of the computer, so to speak. If we want to take a very formal definition of what an adversary means, we could look to the National Institutes of Standards and Technology and define an adversary as a person, group, organization, or government that conducts or has the intent to conduct detrimental activities. Detrimental is a really curious word to use here. Some might choose the word attack. I actually would not, because attack is quite strong, but certainly that idea that an adversary is some entity in the world that means to do us harm, and since this is a cyber conference, through some computer or ICT related means is probably something that we can settle on. However, when we start looking at adversaries and how they operate, things get a little interesting. Because the common conception around how adversaries function is that they are unified single entities responsible for operations. We have a Lazarus group, we have a Conti, we have a equation group or an APT28, and this represents a whole entity that is approaching us with a set of tools and capabilities, intentions, and then does us harm in some way by stealing secrets or wiping our machines or executing ransomware. However, the operational reality, especially, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but for anyone who's worked in offensive operations in the cyber realm, whether criminal or otherwise, keep that to yourselves, is that modern cyber operations are rather complex. Even if you've been a pen tester, doing everything yourself is a pain in the ass, quite frankly. You're most likely relying on a team of individuals and not building all of your own tools, but rather relying on individuals with specialized skill sets and interoperating with one another, doing what it is that you do best, and then either providing or selling that access to others. The expectation that a single entity can do everything as part of the entire kill chain, or if you're filling in your MITRE ATT&CK matrix and so forth, is possible, but as we start getting into ever more complex examples of cyber operations, it begins to become a bit more unrealistic. So if we look, and this is very state operator centric, at the nature of cyber operations, certainly we have some overriding authority that's giving us orders. Hackers with some exceptions, of course, as always, are probably not doing operations of their own accord or desire. Someone's telling them what to do, or they have some mission or goal in mind. And from that, we have a group or some entity that's developing technical capabilities, the individuals that write the malware, that develop the infrastructure, create the command and control frameworks and so forth, and then the operators that are actually using this in engagement. And even in engagements, we can see distinctions between those teams that establish initial access into environments and then handing that off to other entities that engage in the actual hands-on keyboard, lateral movement, and subsequent actions on objectives. So very much a hierarchy when we start talking about complex, lengthy, detailed cyber operations. But the thing is that this isn't just our advanced persistent threats or nation states. I hear that word and it's like nails on a chalkboard or whatever, but you can ask me why that is later on. But it's not just APTs, but rather the criminal space has also evolved. So while we see this nice hierarchical structure of what, say, the NSA looks like, or the GRU or the FSB and so forth, e-crime actors have gotten very specialized in their applications, where we have initial access brokers who are running info stealers or landing initial access campaigns via phishing and then handing that off to those who are willing to pay for such access in criminal forms. But also the developers of tools and the brokers of access to those items and selling access to these as well, because not all e-crime actors are going to be developing their own items straight from source code, but rather acquiring capabilities that exist on the underground or black markets. And finally, as I'm sure many individuals in the room are aware, we have this entire ecosystem of ransomware as a service, where it's not that you're dealing with Lockbit or Conti or Alpha or some other group as a unified entity, but rather operating in an affiliate model where you have a ransomware developer that controls or maintains the infrastructure that then sells access to that to other parties that'll actually use it in operations, and then the developers take a cut off the top of whatever ransom eventually gets paid out. So again, very complex operations, and arguably in some ways as complex, if not more so, than what we see in state-sponsored intrusions. So as we look at this example of what an adversary is, adversary cyber operations increasingly represent the interconnection of various skills and specialities that do not all necessarily reside in the same entity or even within the same organization in order to complete complex cyber operations, whether that's a ransomware campaign or a government espionage operation of some sort. So what does that mean for our current threat environment? So this isn't going to be a very dry and boring threat brief. I'm not going to do that to you. That would be mean. But really, when we talk about the threat environment, do I have any Witcher fans in the room? Okay, a couple hands. Yay, I'm not alone in being a complete nerd. We've seen this sort of conjunction of the spheres, to use a term from that. Or if we want to look at this in a much simpler way and less nerdy, a convergence of the techniques that are leveraged by adversaries. Once upon a time, you would have entities that create their own bespoke malware or tools and bring those on engagements. Now we see something a little bit different. Mimikatz. Mr. Del P has done the world a great favor or great disservice, depending upon who you are and where you reside in terms of network operations, in creating Mimikatz. Mimikatz is a tool that spans the ecosystem from penetration testers to the most advanced state-sponsored adversaries. But we also see this in terms of other tools, Cobalt Strike. There's been much talk about how Cobalt Strike is being replaced with other remote access tools and so forth. I'm not seeing it really in my visibility. Certainly other tools exist, but Cobalt Strike remains by far and away the most popular and prevalent that is out there among the commercial or cracked and pirated frameworks that are out there in the environment right now. But we also have tools like Bloodhound. Now, quick question, is Bloodhound an offensive or a defensive tool? It's both. But as a result, it does a very effective job, whether you're using Bloodhound or something maybe a little bit more simple like AD-Find or so forth, of enumerating networks. And again, we see this ranging from penetration testing engagements to state-sponsored adversaries and ransomware entities that are surveilling the environments that they get into. But even things like Windows sysinternals. It's like, okay, if I want to dump memory from a process or so forth, okay, I'll use procdump. Looking at these sorts of dual-use tools, extending even into commercial frameworks like remote maintenance and management software, the bane of my existence. Not to pick on AnyDesk specifically, you could put TeamViewer, Splashtop, or anything else in there. But adversaries, again, spanning the entire gamut of motivations and sponsorship, are using these sorts of items interchangeably because, one, it makes their lives easier, and two, it remains effective. We had a discussion, I believe yesterday, or maybe it was earlier today, about how you have the African perspective that the lions wake up in the morning and run, and you don't have to necessarily be faster than the lion, just faster than the antelope who's next to you. Well, similarly, for cyber operations, from an adversarial perspective, like, you don't have to innovate across every operation that you execute. You just need to be better than the organizations that you're targeting. And unfortunately, as defenders, we do have a lot more that we should and could be doing. So in looking at the current threat environment, while historically there was probably a greater degree of individual innovation or customization around tools and tradecraft, that can be very effective to try to avoid detection because you're coming up with unique ways of operating in individual engagements. But at the same time, it also creates very specific fingerprints that if I know that this malware, this technique involved or this tool is only limited to one group or entity, if I observe that in some environment, well, then I know within a certain degree of certainty that that's the entity that's responsible. However, now our current reality is that adversaries are generally converging on the same general set of tools and techniques, using and abusing open source software, cracked commercial tools, and living off the land techniques, binaries, and scripts and so forth in order to prosecute operations. Theoretically, this could make detection easier. We had a discussion on detection engineering just prior to this, and as a detection engineer myself, I can say that saying it's easy to find these sorts of things, especially when they start blending over into legitimate tools, is probably a statement that you don't want to make in a seasoned audience. But it also results in a muddied picture as far as responsibility is concerned. If everyone's using the same tradecraft with some fuzzing around the edges, being able to differentiate between a APT29 and a pick your ransomware flavor of the week starts to become a little bit more difficult until you actually see what that operation resulted in or what its intentions were. That gets us into the division of labor that we were observing and hinted at in the previous section on adversaries. So the current threat environment, as we've already discussed, consists of adversaries that are not unitary. Instead, we observe multiple teams engaged in operations. As part of this, we see adversaries then capable of sort of plug-and-play capabilities that I don't necessarily need to use the same access broker every time or buy my domains or other compromised infrastructure or use the same botnet every time if I'm trying to build a denial of service network or trying to set up burnable command and control hop points and so forth. I can pick and choose based upon the market that's involved or spin up additional capabilities and fund them if I'm part of a shadowy government organization of some sorts. What that means is that I start getting lots of replay and reuse of capabilities. And more importantly, that those capabilities are not necessarily linked unitarily to a single entity operator or so forth, but rather can shift depending upon who is acquiring those services at any given point in time. We can even observe this in terms of source code and tool development, that the developer who is responsible for this piece of software or whatever that may be associated with state-based operations realized that if they wanted to afford their holidays in Crimea or so forth, that they could do a much easier job of doing so if they broke bad, so to speak, and began writing ransomware tools and so forth. But we see the same sorts of fingerprints within that developer moving from one organization to another, and thus, not to say that reverse engineering is not a viable enterprise, it's a very difficult one, and I suck at it. But if we start looking at fingerprints within tools and techniques, we start tracking developers and not tracking the actual actors. Which gets us into the visibility conundrum when it comes to not just our state intelligence agencies and defenders, but especially the commercial threat intelligence space. Because out there is the truth. The truth is out there. More nerdery. But that truth comes from a variety of places, or we get different perspectives on it depending upon where our data is coming from. So maybe we have internal or product telemetry. I am a EDR vendor and I'm sucking up all that data into the cloud and analyzing it, or I am tapping into the telecommunication companies within the country that I operate and I'm gathering all the net flow. That's kind of scary, actually. But also there are commercial data sets that are out there that I can leverage, buy, subscribe to, etc. incident response data if I'm involved in such activities. But then even if you have all three of these, it doesn't necessarily get you everything, which is why so much of what passes for threat intelligence analysis and conclusions really comes down to just, what's the vibe that I feel right now as far as this is concerned. That may be a little too dismissive, but the general idea here is that we lack a certain degree of omniscience or universal knowing when it comes to how operations take place, and instead resemble these poor fellows who are trying to figure out what the hell an elephant is without being able to look at it. We get pieces of the puzzle, but never necessarily all of the pieces. We may get many of them, and I think we're getting better there, but it still leaves gaps in our understanding of who is involved in what it is that they're doing. So if we're looking at the flow of cyber operations, some adversary entity out there has an objective or a purpose: make money, follow orders, steal secrets, etc. They then perform some sort of target development and reconnaissance to figure out what it is they're doing, who it is they're going after, and then conduct some operation to get into that environment, to break in, to exploit it, and then act on the objectives that they were given at the very beginning. Lots of things going on here. But if we look at what we actually have visibility into as defenders, we do pretty well when it comes to these latter stages, how adversaries got in and what they did on the environment. We get that from incident response data. We see that in the tools and capabilities that are captured after the incident is concerned. Maybe we get some insight into what happened just prior to that. We could see the port scanning that took place, or the phishing if we look hard enough and so forth. Although we don't always get this. It really depends upon our data retention, how well we know what to look for, and so forth. But then as we start getting at the beginning of operations, we typically have no frickin' clue here. We can theorize purpose and intention, but very, very rarely, if ever, will we actually know. We can infer based upon what an adversary did if they completed a kill chain or finalized an operation, but we still don't know why necessarily. Now, there are some exceptions to this. If you are a state-based intelligence agency of some skill, you are probably on your adversaries' computers yourself and figuring out what the hell it is that they are doing. Most of us, I'm guessing, are not in such a position, so that's not available to us. Or if you are very flexible in terms of your ethics, you could just violate the law and hack back and figure this out for yourself. I'm not advocating for it or recommending that, because there are laws, and there is a phrase that we like to use in America called "fuck around and find out," and you don't want to get to the finding out stage of this necessarily. So, part of the problem with this is that as we look at the various data sources that are available, a lot of people end up fishing in the same pond. We might have some degree of internal visibility, whether it's our own organization or if we're a vendor of some sort, our tool or whatever it is that we're selling in the marketplace. But otherwise, everyone's just kind of poking at virus total, or enriching things in domain tools, or taking a look at Malware Bazaar. Thank you very much, abuse.ch. Wonderful tools through the organization, or looking things up in public data sets and so forth. And that means, what that means is that so much of the unique insight that, someone was going to take a picture, I think. Okay. What that means is that so much of what we think about some scary, unique insight from companies whose names I will not mention because there may be employees of them in the crowd, and I don't actually want to insult anyone, rather just spark some thinking and introspection, is that we think that big scary company full of ex-agents of certain intelligence agencies or whatnot has all the answers and so forth, when really everyone is just kind of dealing with glimpses of the picture from a first-hand source and then supplementing that with the same damn data that everyone else is looking at, or at least everyone that can afford it to a certain extent. So what that means is that we have conclusions that fail to capture the entirety of what's going on in adversary space, and oftentimes converge due to our own dependencies on common visibility that give us a skewed perception of what is going on. All right, adversaries and tools. We are all tools. Okay, maybe not you. I'm a tool. I'm sorry. In looking at that, CTI describes events and actions. We look at what happened in the network that we monitor or defend, or within our customers that are asking us for advice and guidance. And then we observe the effects and methods that took place as part of that action. That someone intruded into a network, deployed some capabilities, and then executed some action on objectives. That analysis, however, is very limited, if at all, capturing the how and why of that operation and why it took place. But at the same time, it seems that so many of us within the threat intelligence space are more than happy to start making claims on intent, purpose, and responsibility. Now again, if I've observed what the final outcome of a given operation is, like, oh, you ransomed the network in order to then extort cryptocurrency from a victim. That seems pretty obvious, right? Well, there are counterexamples, whether in Ukraine and certain countries of Eastern and Central Europe right now, as well as an ongoing campaign in the Middle East, mostly involving or affecting Israel, where we've seen ransomware, functions like ransomware, encrypts files like ransomware, delivers ransom notes like ransomware, where it becomes quite obvious that the entities responsible have no intention or really care whether anyone pays up. They're simply using ransomware as a cover for wiping operations. Progressing as adversaries and using a capability that is associated with criminal operations in order to achieve state-based goals and disruptive effects. So in this case, even if we see that, oh, they're stealing information, it must be the Chinese or something like that, we lapse into this lazy thinking given assumptions and what we think that we know, when really all it is that we can prove and rely upon is how these actions took place and what tools and capabilities were used in order to put them into effect. Now again, there are always exceptions. As I say in my CTI class, the only fundamental rule of CTI is it depends. But within that scope, we can at least look at what the underlying trend line of what we're looking at as analysts is saying, that there's a great amount of uncertainty, and what we have some certainty on does not allow us to make certain claims that nonetheless become quite popular if you look at media and other outlets that then go and say that, you know, the Russians are in the power grid, or the Chinese have stolen all the intellectual property, or make up something else, I don't know. Because the analytical reality is that as we've seen adversarial methods converge on a common set of tactics, techniques, and procedures, behaviors, that adversary tracking thus has devolved into tracking these common sets of behaviors. Now, from a defender's perspective, that's fine. If I know that adversaries are operating in this way, again, taking a detection engineering or a threat hunting or similar perspective, that's great. I can inform my security operations center, my incident responders, of what these common techniques look like and orient defense around them. But because this overall landscape is muddied in certain fashion, we still make the error of persisting that we have or claiming that we have some unique insight into this field when we've seen adversaries basically picking and choosing from a common set or menu of operations and then saying that we have some unique idea or understanding of who or what this adversary is and what it is that they desire. So what does this look like? I've given lots of theory. Theory is cool, but I like examples because it illustrates what we're talking about. So where have we seen this before? Yes, I'm a Star Wars fan as well. Sorry. Winty. Oh, Winty. Winty's been around for a while. Winty is a malware family, right? Well, maybe Winty's also a group. So Winty goes back a bit. So this report from Kaspersky on their secure list websites from 2013, I believe. And Winty as an entity was attacking and breaching the gaming industry and stealing code and other sorts of things. But then we've seen an evolution where Winty, or what we refer to as Winty, then turns into some sort of quasi-state-sponsored espionage campaign that morphs into something that Mandiant at least refers to partially as APT-41. And then we see the U.S. government, in all of its wisdom and so forth, then decide to criminally indict individuals responsible for some of these actions under the rubric of APT-41 and using a malware called Winty. But as we start pulling the thread on Winty, and I highly recommend reading this article, there's a list of resources at the end of this presentation, so you don't need to jot these down immediately. Daniel Gordon, who is a friend of mine, really has punctured the balloon of Winty or whatever to ask us, what the hell is Winty at this point? Been tracking it for over 10 years, and yet it encompasses multiple adversary groups all linked to a tool that's evolved over time for which we don't really know the provenance or source of its development and source code, yet we persist in claiming that this is some unified entity. So we have malware that's associated with some campaigns almost 10 years ago, and then appears in other campaigns. Like, oh, it must be the same people, right? Well, looking at the pattern of intrusions involved in spreading from potential commercial espionage or similar sorts of identity theft items in the electronic gaming industry, and then transitioning into state-sponsored espionage against targets of strategic significance, that looks really frickin' weird. And as a result, we've seen, because we're relying on linking all these entities to a tool or a capability, that the tool now becomes conflated with a group, and engendering significant confusion about just what the hell Winty is. If we look at Winty and pull the thread on this a bit harder, we see that Winty is a case where overlapping visibility, the lack of true root cause analysis for given intrusions, because you have CTI analysts or organizations who are just poking at the malware involved without actually understanding the entire incident, or maybe they just pulled it off of VirusTotal and thought it was submitted from a certain country, which, if you really know how that works, is effectively meaningless in most cases, and then started conflating that capability on its own with being a single entity that has its own agenda and so forth. Very strange. And again, something that we can read up more on, but we don't have that much time and I don't want to put anyone to sleep. So Winty, tool to group, very confusing, very unfortunate. But they're not alone. Sandworm Group. This is an entity near and dear to my heart. I do a lot of research around Sandworm. But having said that, Sandworm in itself is kind of weird. We start out, again, almost 10 years ago, with exploitation of a zero-day vulnerability and Eyesight Partners, which then became Mandiant, which then became FireEye, which then became Mandiant, which now is Google, released a report covering this group and linking it to Russian intelligence. And then we see Sandworm again popping up in not one, but two electric utility events, disruptive events in Ukraine, something that I've worked an awful lot on in a past life when I worked for the industrial control system organization Dragos. And we've seen, again, the wanted posters because these are effective in deterring cyber operations, right? Naming and shaming who the individuals are that are responsible for this activity. And we even wrote a damn book about these people. That's not to say it's a bad book. It's a really good book. Andy Greenberg is a nice guy. It's worth checking out, I guess, although I don't agree with everything in there. But the result of this is that we have a decade's worth of activity across multiple disciplines. Looks kind of weird. Because we see this combination of disruptive operations, the power events in Ukraine, the NotPetya event, the Olympic destroyer incident in just prior to the Olympic Games a few years ago. We have this assertion from government as well as private sector entities that Sandworm is linked to Russia's military intelligence organization, the GRU. And then they kind of like to target Ukraine a lot. Like, okay, like put these three things together, you have a Sandworm. That's like saying like, oh, behold, a featherless biped, I have a man. Someone had to get that. No? Damn it. Anyway, the idea being is that we come up with a description of an entity, but one that is not necessarily unique, because we've seen multiple entities that have engaged in disruptive operations, not all of which have been attributed. Other entities that are linked to the GRU, such as APT-28. And targeting Ukraine has certainly become quite the mess right now, unfortunately for the Ukrainians, with various entities across Russian cyber operations partaking in multiple degrees to mixed effectiveness in trying to operate within that invaded country. And so as a result, we have to ask ourselves, like, well, what the hell is a Sandworm then? From an operational complexity point of view, we have to ask ourselves, can the same group of people, the same unit, the same cohesive band of brothers or whatever you want to call them, who are sitting out in the fishbowl outside of Moscow, have they developed NotPetya, Olympic Destroyer, and Indestroyer 2, along with a host of other tools, plus weaponized Maldocs and so forth, acquire the infrastructure to deploy them and execute these operations? Maybe it's a very big unit. I don't know. I don't know Russian force structure that well, and maybe it doesn't probably matter. But what sort of bureaucratic or lines of operation and control exist within an organization like Russia's military intelligence organization? Because we look at the varying impacts involved from repurposing a leaked wiper from the National Security Agency, NotPetya, repurposing an exploit in order to enable a wiper, NotPetya, to the industrial control system events that we've seen, Indestroyer, the 2015 event, Indestroyer 2, it's not often you see malware get a sequel. How many unique skill sets are involved? So maybe all of this falls under the broader rubric of the Sandworm team from a Russian military intelligence perspective. But if you're telling me that this is the same group of 15, 25, or 50 people, that seems like a stretch given the wide variety of actions that we've linked to this entity. So we have this assertion from many, which I agree with, that Sandworm is functionally linked to a unit called Unit 74455. Okay, that's fine. It's been claimed by enough entities or whatever, and I've seen enough evidence myself that I'm willing to say that operations linked to Sandworm are associated with this unit. But the complexity and variety of capabilities that we've observed since 2013 imply that there's more. Whether that's repurposing the black energy framework in order to serve as an initial access and information gathering mechanism for the 2015 Ukrainian power event, onward to the deployment of multiple wipers of varying degrees of complexity within the current conflict or the most recent phase of the conflict in Ukraine. So Sandworm, in my professional opinion, as someone who's studied this group, is not a unitary object as much as it is an opportunistic collection of capabilities under Russian state control that the GRU directs for very malign reasons, to execute multiple objectives. And there are certainly overlaps in the various tools and infrastructure used by this entity, but there's a lot more going on here than just saying like, hey, it's this group of guys in this office right here. All right, APT-29, to stick with the Russian theme. Yeah, I need to get that on a t-shirt, by the way. So yeah, Cozy Bear, APT-29, maybe Nobelium? What does that mean? Well, APT-29 goes back. One of the entities that was involved in a variety of strategic campaigns, but perhaps most memorably in targeting entities associated with the 2016 elections in the U.S., which brought us the wonders that were the Donald Trump administration. I live there, man, so, just don't get me started. From that, we've seen a variety of other campaigns from APT-29 over time, culminating a couple of years ago in that big, nasty SolarWinds event. Anyone have to work SolarWinds as an incident responder in here? Okay, you guys, oh, yep, we got a hand. All right. My heart goes out to you. That was a pain. It was a really epic hack. It was very well done. But we see at first Mandiant calling this unknown group, whatever the hell they call that, 2452, and then they merged this into APT-29. Okay, it's Mandiant's group. They can do whatever the hell they want, I guess. But what does that mean? It means that we had a group that conducted this epic supply chain hack of SolarWinds and Microsoft. And then this evolved, the same entity, from a group that basically engaged in phishing and using tools like Cobalt Strike Beacon and so forth for politically motivated actions previously. That seems a little different. So in looking at APT-29, what even is APT-29 anymore? Historically, we see fairly selective target-specific phishing activity. I mean, these guys were epic back in the day in terms of how selective they were, how good they were at picking targets to send messages to and whatnot, having worked several campaigns. And used a variety of off-the-shelf, publicly or commercially available tools and frameworks like Cobalt Strike Beacon. Okay, that's one way of defining an adversary. But then, when we get to the present, we see something else entirely. While Cobalt Strike Beacon was still used as a post-exploitation framework as part of the SolarWinds campaign, as we've talked about already, everyone's using Cobalt Strike Beacon, so that's not a very strong signifier or sign of uniqueness for this group. But instead what we have observed is the use of a very complex and very specific capability, Sunburst, that was able to, at compile time, inject malicious code into the SolarWinds Orion software. So some continued use of public tools, but an apparent change in victim selectivity, as well as initial access and intrusion mechanisms over time. So as a result, if you're familiar with the ship of Theseus, what started out as APT-29 has changed over the decade that we've known them, so to speak, that we really have to ask ourselves, does what we call APT-29 today in 2023 really equate to what APT-29 was in 2014, 2015? Now, certainly, if we're taking a who-based perspective to attribution, and APT-29 has been linked by several government entities to Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, then perhaps it is the same. But if we're tracking this as a set of behaviors, this ship has been reconstructed while it's been at sea for the last decade or so, and what we observe today is quite different from what we observed originally. Oh, I went backwards. Okay, so let's conclude this up because I'm sure everyone wants to get to their coffee break. So where are we right now? A little confusing. Like, what the hell is this guy talking about? What's going on here? Well, what I'm aiming for here is a degree of clarity in purpose as well as in meaning. That certainly Attributive statements to a degree and tracking of adversaries are possible, but the thing is, we need to be really clear on what it is that we're identifying and what it is that we are tracking as part of intrusion analysis and cyber threat intelligence. That means understanding what our visibility is and the limitations of that visibility in what it is that we are viewing and what it is that we are understanding. So if we want to look at this and come up with some overarching conclusion, we could look at intrusion analysis and threat intelligence as disciplines that need to accept that we don't know everything, that we are tracking just shadows on the wall of the cave, so to speak, that are thrown by the adversaries and mostly reflective of the tools and the capabilities that they are using rather than the adversary themselves. And thus, where insights become less unique than we want to think, but also understand the very interplay between the various entities that are involved in initial access, subsequent interactive operations, action on objectives, and even funding and guiding such operations. It's really complex out there, and to think that we're going to get the complete picture based upon whatever capabilities are available to us is quite the assumption. And I think we need to question how effective we can be in making that assumption moving forward and what value that might bring to those who are looking to us for guidance. So if there's one really short conclusion to this beyond that paragraph that I just showed, it's really about intellectual honesty. Visibility is limited and skewed. But conclusions are still possible. This isn't saying that we can't come up with results around what it is that we're saying. What it means is that we just need to be honest about what sort of results that we can arrive at. That means we must remain true to the data that is available to us, not go beyond what it is that we know, but remain grounded, so to speak, in what it is that we're looking at. Understanding our limitations means that, to use a phrase that maybe it has a Swiss translation or they're French or German, I don't know. But like getting over your skis, so to speak, to the point where you're going to fall over and cause a mess, that we need to understand our limitations and not go beyond them. If we want to practice threat intelligence, and I look at threat intelligence as fundamentally decision support for organizations, whether that's the SOC analyst trying to disposition an alert or the CISO who's trying to understand where they need to invest in capabilities in the long term, threat intelligence needs to then understand what parts of the landscape do we observe, capabilities and actions and tools, and not try to expand beyond that into areas where we're on much less firm ground or on much thinner ice in making claims about who is responsible for these actions, why they might have engaged in this activity, and for what purpose that activity is undertaken for whatever reason. So if you're looking for things like adversary emulation or trying to build detections or a defensive plan around a single entity, we need to understand and take a step back that, do I even know or can I even accurately characterize what that entity is or what it means? And looking at a converged threat environment with multiple entities interacting, understand that while on the one hand I've made life a little bit easier from a defensive standpoint since I've coalesced around a common set of tools, although again, it's not that easy because detecting lol bins and RMM tools and so forth is a real pain in the ass. At least pain trying to disposition between legitimate use and malicious use. Anyway, entirely separate presentation, part of which was right before this one. But understanding how it is that we inform and guide those that look to us for advice and not going beyond that which we can support and that which we understand. So with that, I think we have time for some questions. I'm going to actually advance the slide, so that's me. Yay. I'm not hard to find. JF Slowik at Twitter, also InfoSec, it's JF Slowik at infosec.exchange. Catch me in the hall or whatever. But this is also a list of resources. I should have put this on a paste bin with a QR code because that doesn't look suspicious at all, and let you download it very easily, but certainly take a picture of that if you would like. This is just a partial list. There's a lot of other resources that you could look at. Most of these items here, though, have good links to other items as well. With that.
Thank you a lot for this interesting presentation. So we will take a few questions. Okay, perfect.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was a little confused, I have to say, with because a couple of the things that you said seemed to me to be at odds with one another. So I'm going to challenge you on that if I could. The last couple of slides were saying, hey, we need to stay grounded with things that we know. Mm-hmm. But earlier you talked about an example of a common tool being ransomware, being deployed in an environment where somebody didn't actually want to collect any ransom.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems like that relied on stuff you wouldn't know if you weren't paying attention to, geopolitical events. So how do you sort of bridge that gap between these are the things that I can observe and I can state confidently, and these are the things I believe to be true based on things that I'm observing elsewhere?
Yes, and that's an excellent question. And for example, with the ransomware, that's not quite ransomware examples, those would have been hard. We've gotten help from others. So for example, looking at, there's so many of them involved in Ukraine. I can't even remember the last one that came up that Microsoft reported on. There are sources of information beyond just the incident that can enrich our understanding in certain incidents. That's good, because it allows us to see that in the case of certain things posing as ransomware and just mysteriously targeting government and critical infrastructure institutions in Ukraine, Poland, and Latvia or Lithuania, I don't remember exactly, is maybe a little suspicious. And not only that, but we can potentially confirm it because we get sources of information beyond intrusion analysis that begin bleeding into adversary space, where adversaries are making or recording their decisions. So that is a example that sort of proves the general point that very rarely do we have that happen. So while it's possible, and again, like I said earlier, the one mantra in threat intelligence is it depends. There are times when we can get lucky, either because adversaries screw up, they leave a bunch of crap on a staging server, we have a friendly intelligence service that says, hey, you might want to look at this, or other sorts of things pop up. That there are cases where we can go beyond what it is that we're normally stuck with. But most of the time, assessing intent, purpose, and so forth from just what it is that we're observed, what we can observe on our own, doesn't allow us to make that leap with any justification. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other question? So.
Okay. I wore a red fleece today in case anyone wanted to throw rotten produce, especially tomatoes, at me. So I'm glad no one did. Thank you.
Thank you.